Trump had a report published about him by Politico about what Trump's views are on NATO, the Transatlantic Treaty Organization, and what his views are in respect to the war in Ukraine and what deal he might be willing to make to the Russians. And any way you slice it, a second Trump term means a radical repositioning of America's role in NATO, and ultimately a reduction in America's contributions to NATO's coffers, which keep up military bases and other stations in Europe, which could see American troops drastically reduced from. The exact parameters of what this would mean is still being debated. Different Trump officials and the advisors in the administration, and when we talk about elections, we don't just talk about electing one man, we talk about electing a whole administration around him. They don't agree on every single line, and they haven't written out the poll plan, but we can get an idea, which would mean less American funding, less American influence, less American deployments. The Europeans have to carry their own weight, and possibly the Europeans have to carry a lot more of their own weight by themselves without the assistance of the United States way before they have the ability to, especially if this was instituted within the next 5 years, this plan that's being talked about. And that's on top of the reports in here about his deal around Ukraine, which has caused some stir from the Ukrainians, including a response from Zelensky, which we will check out in a moment. But first, let's check out the Politico report. Donald Trump has threatened to leave NATO so many times, or has appeared to anyway, that for many of his critics, it's a question of when, not whether, he ditched the 75-year-old alliance if he's reelected president in November. But in truth, Trump would be unlikely to quit NATO outright, according to interviews with former Trump national security officials and defense experts who are likely to serve in a second Trump term. But even if he doesn't formally leave the organization, that doesn't mean NATO would survive a second Trump term intact. In return for continued U.S. participation, Trump would not only expect European countries to drastically increase their spending on NATO, his main complaint when he was president, but also undertake what one defense expert familiar with the thinking inside Trump's National Security Advisory Circle, Dan Caldwell, describes as a radical reorientation of NATO. We don't really have a choice anymore, Caldwell told Political magazine, citing rising U.S. debt, flagging military recruiting, and a defense industrial base that can't keep up with the challenge from both Russia and China. Neither Trump nor his campaign has yet named a new national security team or openly embraced a new agenda for NATO. The campaign did not respond to several requests for comment for this article, but the former officials and experts who spoke for this article, some on the record and some on the condition of anonymity, are engaged in an ongoing debate within Trump world over how hard to push the Europeans towards a security architecture more to Trump's liking. According to these officials, the U.S. would keep its nuclear umbrella over Europe during a second term by maintaining its air power in bases in Germany, England, and Turkey, and its naval forces as well. Meanwhile, the bulk of infantry, armor, logistics, and artillery would ultimately pass from the American to European hands. Part of the plan was floated in an article published in February of 2023, but the Trump-affiliated Center for Renewing America, by the Trump-affiliated Center for Renewing America, but in the months since, there's been an emerging and more detailed consensus among Trump supporters on an outline of a new concept for NATO. So, the idea of us keeping our nuclear umbrella there, maintaining air bases and some bases in Germany, while the bulk of our infantry, armor, and logistics artillery pass from American to European hands, meaning that our deployments, we would bring back the bulk of our soldiers, keep some air bases, keep a few small bases, with the majority of our threat basically being tactical to strategic nuclear weapons, leading any invading army to obliteration on the European continent. Now, I'm not necessarily against the general idea of what he's saying here. The problem is always going to be a question of time and timing, because if Trump gets into office in 2025 and then reduces our troop deployments by 70 to 80%, is that going to be interpreted as we still stand strong with NATO and will respect Article 5 and consider Europe's defense a key national security interest of the United States at a time of increased Russian aggression? Or is that going to be interpreted as America's pulling back, America doesn't care that much about NATO, If America cared about NATO, not only would it continue to have these deployments here, but it certainly would continue to have or maybe expand these deployments while the Russians are invading Ukraine and having the largest war on European soil. It's a question of context and interpretation. Because when you're making defense policy and you're making national security policy and you want to deter your enemy, ultimately the message that you want to send or the message that you intended to send does not matter. What matters is the message received by the person you intend to deter. So if this is being pulled back, not to send the message of, hey, Russians, we don't care about Europe, we actually just don't want to spend so much on it, that might not be interpreted that way. And so there would have to be tons of verbal commitments or other things to reposition the United States, on top of the fact that right now, while the Europeans are still getting on their toes when it comes to defense spending, but while Trump was in office, I think it was like 9 out of the country, like 9 out of how many countries are in NATO? I think like about 33 countries where it's actually meeting the 2% threshold. Now the number is about 23 out of 33. Still not all of them, but now the majority. We see them moving in the right direction when it comes to Europeans taking care of their own security and not leaving the burden to the United States. I know Trump will claim some of that. Biden will claim some of that. Maybe both of them deserve some of the credit. I think a lot of it has to do with the circumstances of the West's failures on Ukraine policy, leading to a Russian invasion of Ukraine, making them reconsider the importance of deterrence and European defense spending. So I think a lot of this is more circumstantial than it is directly Biden or Trump's fault or Trump's, claim and how much credit they can take. But still, you still need to note it. Where were we? So about this, again, this plan is not horrible in its entirety. It's just a question of timing, when these types of these type of burdens would be passed over, and the message that is sent by this realignment. These are the things that concern me most by this. Because to be honest, while in some instances there might be a way for you to spend less money but achieve your strategic aims, a lot of times people selling it like, oh, you will be able to spend 80% less money into NATO with no defensive downsides. A lot of times that's cope. The shift they envision would involve significantly and substantially downsizing America's security role, stepping back instead of being the primary provider of combat in Europe. Somebody who provides support only in times of crisis, said Caldwell, who recently served as a senior advisor to Russell Vought, the former senior Trump official who in May was named as policy director for the Republican National Committee and who is expected to play a senior role in a second Trump administration. Vought is also president of the CRA, the Center for, I think it's Republican Renewal. I forget the exact abbreviation meaning. Now, this next part is the thing that scares me, and I do not think that there is a good reason for this. I understand the justification. I don't think it achieves what it is asking to achieve, and I also think that it degrades Article 5, NATO's purpose, and brings the total value of NATO down. Let me read this for you. Another part of the emerging Trump game plan is a two-tier NATO system. The idea, first proposed by another senior former Trump administration official, retired Army Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, means that member countries that have not yet met this target spending of 2% of GDP on defense wouldn't enjoy the defense largesse and security guarantees of the United States, according to one Trump-aligned national security expert who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe internal discussions. This could be seen to be in defiance of Article 5 of the treaty, which obliges every member to take such actions it deems necessary to assist whoever is attacked. But members of the Trump foreign policy brain trust noted that the language in Article 5 is flexible and does not require any member to respond with military force. Trump has consistently expressed that NATO allies have ripped us off, but by not meeting the 2% spending target. Most recently, Trump actually appeared to invite a Russian attack against NATO deadbeats, saying he'd encourage the Russians to do whatever the hell they want with member countries that have not yet met the defense spending target, a decade after NATO allies pledged to do so at the 2014 summit in Wales during the Obama administration. It was Obama that pushed, by the way, for that 2% being mandatory at the whale summit, because he was also upset about them not paying their fair share. Now, am I upset about NATO countries asking for defense commitments from the United States while not paying their fair share? Absolutely. Do I think this is a good way to do it? Absolutely not. I think this brings down the value of the entire system. If the Russians are trying to gauge our dedication to European security, if they're trying to gauge how much we care if Europe goes down or does not go down. And let me say, I think Americans have a reason to care, not only from a humanitarian perspective of the Russians occupying and filling mass graves is not good, but there's also the problem of Europe being our main export market. And if you're a manufacturing worker in Ohio, one of the few that are left, or somebody who sells their goods in Europe, having European stability is probably important. And that's not the only way that the United States and Europe is intertwined. When it comes to tech sharing and research and development, when it comes to culture and family and all sorts of other ties, the United States and Europe, and of course security commitments, are quite intertwined, very tight. And so to start saying that actually these members, which will have a clear list of which ones are not covered by our defenses because they don't get to 2% threshold, putting aside the calculations of how much effect that's actually going to have to make those countries pay the 2%. What is the message that is sent? Not what is meant to be sent, because the message that Trump wants to send is pay the money, pay the money, pay the money. But that's not necessarily the only message that is received. The message that it could also be received is America does not care that much about Europe, especially if they're making Article 5, a part of the treaty that's kind of fundamental. It's what the whole thing is built around. The idea that if one country is attacked, everyone comes to assistance. Once you start to water it down, the question becomes, could it be watered down further? Because if it's a question of payment, if it's a question of money, if it's a question of what we can get out of them, and not a question of their defense being good for all of us, then you could leave some people out of the defense bubble and make the Russians question our dedication to the alliance. You are watering down the most integral part. Honestly, the only really important part. There's other parts of NATO that are important when it comes to it being a fundraising apparatus for the Ukrainian stuff, but the most important part of NATO, you are watering that down. For what? For what? Another 500 million from a country that's GDP is the size of one American state? I don't think it makes sense. I don't think it makes defense sense. I don't think it makes sense from what we want to achieve in Europe. I don't think it makes sense at all. I don't think it makes sense at all. I also want to throw out there that not only do I think the Russians are going to take some hint from this, but I also think that the message that is being sent is not just, hey, vaguely, we don't care that much about Europe. Donald Trump has specifically asked the Russians that if they don't pay the 2%, invade them. And you could say, oh, he meant that as a joke, or he wasn't that serious, or whatever interpretation you want. The Russians were certainly listening, just like they were listening when Donald Trump asked them to hack into his political opponent's campaign information, and they did. And so I will say that the Russians are also listening to this. This isn't something that is just like opaque and vaguely in the ether. This is something that the Russians are certainly listening to. Also, last part of this article that I think is definitely of note that we should certainly talk about. A swift resolution of the 2.5-year Ukraine conflict would also likely play a key role in Trump's plan for NATO. As part of the plan for Ukraine that has not been previously reported, the presumptive GOP nominee is mulling a deal whereby NATO countries commit to no further eastward expansion, specifically Ukraine and Georgia. So this deal about the war in Ukraine would include the country of Georgia and their prospective NATO wishes. And negotiations with Russian President Vladimir Putin over how much Ukrainian territory Moscow can keep, according to two other Trump-aligned national security experts. Okay, so a stopping in the expansion of NATO after Sweden and Finland got in, of course. And after that, negotiating away Ukrainian territory. Now, the deal that has been most floated for how much territory the Trump campaign or Trump would be willing to give up to the Ukrainians, the one deal that I have heard is that the Russians would get Crimea and this is something that Trump has said publicly, this is the one deal he mentioned publicly, is that the Russians would get Crimea and the Russians would get the Donbass. Now, what gets me about this deal, now there are positives to that. I mean, the Ukrainians would get back the rest of Kherson, the Ukrainians would get back Zaporizhia, but that would still mean the majority of the oblasts that the Russians are currently demanding they would get. But not only that, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, Chasiv Yar, New York, Toretsk, all these other cities and villages that I'm not mentioning, that amounts altogether, Seversk, like if you put all these places together, Slovansk, I mean, you're getting like 100,000, 200,000, you're getting all these people who would have to pick up their stuff and leave and let the Russians come in and then replace them with settlers, which is what they're doing in Mariupol. If you go to Mariupol, the locals that stay are largely the elderly. So you've got local elderly people and migrants from Russia. Sometimes, a lot of times, they're poorer migrants from the Asian parts of Russia, like Tuva. Maybe they're from Murmansk. Maybe they're from St. Petersburg. But the point is, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of illegal settlers being moved into occupied territory as the Russians rapidly conscript and send into the meat grinder those in occupied territory, illegally, by the way, because you cannot do that, while deporting Ukrainian children and adopting them off illegally as well. This is what the Russians are doing. So this is what Ukraine would have to do or accept in locations like Kramatorsk without a fight for a deal like this, if he truly intends to give them all of the Donbass, meaning that a lot of people who are in the Ukrainian armed forces, so they can fight for the liberation of their homes in the Donbass or protect their homes in Kramatorsk, would then be put in the position, and their colleagues and comrades in arms would be put in the position of being forced to stand there as all their families are evacuated or made to evacuate. Kind of a difficult sell for the Ukrainians. Not to mention the odds of the Russians accepting a withdrawal from Kherson and Zaporizhia comes with its own set of complications. Now, maybe the Russians could say, well, we're stopping NATO expansion, so in a way, we've defeated NATO and its continued crawl eastward. We've stopped it at the gates of Donetsk or whatever. We stopped it at the gates of Ukraine, the gates into Eurasia, whatever it would be. But they would still have to tell a bunch of settlers to leave, which they've already moved in. They'd have to go back on the formal integration of Zaporizhia and Kherson into the Russian Federation, which has already been signed into law. They'd have to give up a bunch of defensible positions that I know that they like because they've been able to create a land bridge to Crimea, which they would have to give up. And they would almost certainly have to, at least in the short term, give up the immediate demands of taking cities like Zaporizhia and Kherson back, which is something the Russians certainly want to do after they occupied it and were pushed out. But that doesn't mean 5-6 years down the line, once America is distracted with, say, a war in Taiwan, they couldn't try again, especially when it comes to the other issue, which we've been talking about, the displacement of all these Ukrainians. All these people would never be able to return home to Crimea, to Donetsk, to Luhansk, these places, those who would have to be removed, the inhumanity of that, nothing worse and more poisonous than shattered freedom. But when it comes to Ukraine not being able to join NATO, this comes with its own set of complications. To me, the worst outcome in this war, the absolute worst outcome outside of literally every inch of Ukraine being occupied right now, is a circumstance that allows the war to be passed down another 5-6 years. And so this goes from a war going from 2014 to 2024, 2025, 2026, to a war that goes from 2014 to 2030. To 2014 to 2032, making it not a decade of war, but 2 decades of war, dragging it out because false agreements were made that we thought were going to last for ceasefires that were going to expand into peace agreements that then were shattered. Just like when the Russians lied about invading Crimea in 2014, just like the Russians lied about their troops being deployed in the Donbass, just like the Russians illegally invaded and violated treaties they signed, like the Budapest Memorandum, and invaded just like the Russians violated Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, and it broke down so they could keep up offensive pressure. And just like the Russians lied that they weren't going to invade in 2022 and then proceeded to lie, why would not the Russians just lie, say, fine, we're going to accept some deal, maybe it'd even be one that's more beneficial for them, and they just get to keep the positions they're at right now, which is almost certainly what the Russians would want to have at the very least at any negotiating table. And then they could just build upon it in the future, invade again in 5 years when the West is distracted with something else. Article 5, which Trump has a policy here that would whittle it down anyway, but Article 5 is supposed to be a steadfast protection that says, if you invade me, you will face the full fire and fury of 33 of the most powerful countries in the world, with stronger countries led by one of the most powerful nuclear powers in the world, widely possessing what is referred to as the most powerful armed forces in the world, which can strike just about anywhere at any time due to a combination of refueling efforts, aircraft carriers, and air bases all around the world. That is what Article 5 means to the people protected by it, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, who would not be able to defend itself in a traditional 1v1 war against the Russians. That's what it means for them. And that's why Ukrainians want it, because they've seen that it's worked for Estonia, it's worked for Latvia, it worked for Lithuania. When the Bulgarians joined in the early 2000s, they joined in large part because they were scared of the Russians coming in again. And they were explicit about that. It's also kind of ironic because it is also the Bulgarian population, which has one of the largest subsets of those who do not support aid to Ukraine. If you check European-wide polling, the majority of Europeans support aid to Ukraine. It's like something like 70 or 70+%. Bulgaria has a large population of those who do not support aid to Ukraine. But if Ukraine was covered by that at the end of this war, they will not be invaded again. If we have a strong Article 5 not whittled down, then it has worked for Estonia, it's worked for Lithuania, it's worked for Latvia, it's worked for all these other countries. Why wouldn't it work for Ukraine if we preserve it? So it's a proven method of success that the Ukrainians want. Now, guaranteeing that they don't join NATO doesn't necessarily 100% mean that they can't have some sort of defensive agreement that stops the Russians from invading again, but it would have to be a pretty strong alternative multilateral or bilateral agreement to stop the Russians from invading again. Something like Russians invade, American troops in Kiev fighting the Russians. Something along those lines. Something steadfast. Something like the American agreement with South Korea. Something like the American agreement with Japan. Something that would create a relationship that would make the Russians think twice, thrice, and never again about invading Ukraine. It'd be better if it was not just the United States, and it was the UK as well, and it was other countries that would join this, and to make it multilateral and therefore stronger, and not just dependent upon one country for its success or failure. This is why, again, NATO would be the best case scenario all around here. But the point is, there has to be some disincentive at the front of any Russian invasion from them invading Ukraine again, or we could very well end up with me being in this country 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now, covering the third Russian invasion of Ukraine within 20 years. And I don't think anybody wants that. Even the most steadfast opponents of Ukraine aid probably do not want to see this war continuing 8 years down the line. And so for me, excluding Ukraine from NATO not only takes a massive poker chip off of the negotiating table, the leverage that could be necessary to get Ukraine the best deal, but it also closes down an opportunity to stop a Russian invasion from happening again. And so unless Trump proposes an alternative that would guarantee Ukraine not get invaded, and let me just say the Budapest Memorandum was supposed to provide that framework when the Ukrainians asked for it in return for giving up their nuclear arsenal, when they gave that sacrifice to the cause of nuclear nonproliferation, which made us safer, made the Russians safer, well, certainly made the Russians safer because they were the ones who got the fucking nukes, and made the British safer, made the whole world safer. That sacrifice should be respected. And if we end up making another flimsy agreement that, oh, we'll come to your defense, and then 2014 happens, they're invaded, and we do bat shit, then we'll just, it feels like we'll just be in the same position again. And we'll just be running in circles. And so there has to be something that stops another Russian invasion from happening. And what has Trump proposed for to replace NATO as that option? Nothing publicly as of now. In fact, if you ask Trump, and he said this publicly, what the major cause of this war is, he says NATO expansion. He also says that in private during the recent debates that Putin told him in private that it was his dream to conquer Ukraine, which to me suggests that maybe it was more than just NATO expansion. The guy who wrote whole essays about how Ukraine doesn't really exist and can only exist as an extension of Russia. The guy who made an hour-long speech at the start of the war about how Ukraine doesn't really exist. It's a post-Soviet state, therefore they have claims to it, which is not only a foundation to invade Ukraine, but a bunch of all other countries. And when Putin was given an opportunity to explain to the West his reasoning for the war, he started talking about how Prince Yaroslav's horse in the year of 482 took a giant shit outside of Kiev, and that's why it's Russian. Makes you think it might be more.
Saramag has donated $100.
So Trump's Ukraine plan centers NATO expansion as a primary cause for the war, which I think is inaccurate, and I think it disregards Russia's ideological motivations, its irredentist motivations, Putin's essays, Putin's speeches. I think it disregards resource motivation. I think it disregards their want to economically dominate Ukraine. I mean, when we talk about what the Russians invaded in 2014, Euromaidan was about the European Union, not NATO expansion. And that's what started this whole war in the first place. After the Ukrainians offered to continue the lease with the Russians in Crimea. That was not enough for them. They invaded anyway. So I think that analysis is wrong. I think that agreeing to give up all of the Donbass, if true, would mean the displacement of tons of Ukrainians who are in unoccupied Donbass right now, which would be a disaster, extremely unpopular. And so that would certainly have to be at the very least adjusted for this to ever even for this to even see the light of day in Ukrainian society. There's a huge question mark about what if the Russians would even accept terms like that. But also, I mean, giving up this territory and then not having the security guarantees. What does Ukraine get out of this deal after almost 3 years of effective resistance against the Russians? I just don't think it's a good deal. And I think if you have somebody running for president who isn't willing to put the financial weight behind Ukrainians to get them the best deal, but not willing to put the military weight behind them to get them the best deal, then you're going to have to settle for a situation that rewards this aggression and sends the message to both the Russian public and the Russian political establishment. We faced down the West. We took on the worst they could throw at us. We survived. We took land. Huzzah. It was a success. And if it's a success, what does that say for the future political class of Russia? Not only Putin and his personal cronies, but those who will come after him, who want to replicate the successes of Putin, who want to replicate and build upon Novorossiya, Greater Russia, make it bigger, make it greater, so to speak. It's concerning. I don't think Trump has particularly thought it out. I don't think he understands the causes of the war well. And I don't think that his plan of a two-tier system for NATO treats Article 5 with the reverence, and I do use that word, reverence, that I think it deserves, if we're going to keep it as a stable institution preserving European security, which is directly tied to American security. And might I just say, for all the Elbridge Colbys out there, all of the Trump advisor types that would join him going into the White House, who want to shift off of Russia because they just need to stare down the Chinese. Let me give you one piece of advice. If you don't care about European security interests, why should they care about American security interests? After 9/11, the Europeans followed us into Afghanistan. Ukraine even followed us into Afghanistan. I think they lost like 36 people. I forget the exact number. Can you Google the exact number of people Ukraine lost in Afghanistan? I think it was, they followed us into Afghanistan, and I think they followed us a little bit into Iraq. It might have been Iraq. I think I might be getting the missions confused. Point is, though, a lot of countries followed us into Afghanistan. after 9/11 to fulfill the Article 5 treaty. 18 killed, 40 wounded from Ukraine. A lot of countries followed us to do that. They didn't, I mean, like, could they have said, oh, well, technically Article 5 just means some commitments, we're going to treat it like, I don't know. No, they treated it with reverence, and they joined us in Afghanistan, and they lost their soldiers over there too. If we don't reciprocate caring about European security interests and covering it in the veil of cost, because let me just throw this out there. Trump has been lying about the cost and what the Europeans have been paying when it comes to the support in Ukraine for a while now. He lied about it at the debates. He lied about it on the campaign trail. Oh, snap. We get a donation? Hey, Aussie T, thank you for the 99-cent donation. I appreciate that, buddy. I can get an Arizona tea with this. Where was I? Oh man, I completely lost where I was. Where was I? Oh, if you want them to care about your security interests, you got to care about theirs. And so if the Europeans don't feel like their basic security interests from a reinvigorated irredentist Russia isn't being respected, why would they care about any sanction that we want to place on the Chinese? Why would they care about any security agreement or pressure we would want them to put on the Chinese, considering the massive economic benefit they get through trading with China? You have to give them a reason to care. And if you don't care about their interests, why would they care about ours? Would we sanction China? Depending on the circumstances, a showdown over Taiwan? Yeah. But the Germans and others have been clear that America's policy on Taiwan isn't necessarily Europe's policy on Taiwan. It's something to consider. If you don't care, why should they care about? I mean, certainly if they have to focus on the Russians and dealing with them all on their lonesome, then certainly they're not going to care about an island of 25 million people off the coast of China that isn't internationally recognized in a formal capacity anyway. Just saying, for all the Eldridge Colbys out there.